And in some of the dialogue that we've had, whenever we engage with our congressional leaders, when we give them sort of our classified analysis on things in the space domain, the immediate concern is, well, how do you tell that to the public? How do you get constituents to understand what's happening in the space domain and the significance behind it? How do you justify the need for a U.S. Space Force, even to a certain extent, right? And a budget that's going to be needed to be able to confront the kind of things that we have to worry about here in the next 10, 20 years.
Hello, welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm Colleen Stover with the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, part of the Aerospace Corporation. Currently in our 5th year of broadcast, we kick off a series that I'm calling Going Faster. Technology is moving faster. Competition in space security and exploration is increasing. Private companies are innovating at a pace government must keep up with in terms of acquisition, resources, and regulations. So we start this series with a look at open source intelligence and how it feeds into our knowledge bank to maintain national security from space. Looking down at the Earth in new and novel ways is not just the domain of governments any longer. Private companies with remote sensing satellites overhead collect, bundle, and sell their data to customers, including governments. How does the U.S. Space Force leverage commercially sourced intelligence? And just what is the threat anyway? What protections need to be in place to trust the data and to protect the business case? So I'm pleased to introduce from the Aerospace Corporation, Colonel Lina Cashin, U.S. Air Force retired, returning to the show to talk to the Space Force's Deputy Chief of Space Operations Intelligence, Chief Master Sergeant Ronald Lerch, and to get perspective from a key commercial entity currently supplying data to government, we brought in Clinton Clark, Vice President at ExoAnalytic Solutions. Remember, if you want to learn more about the Center's deeper research, you can go to csps.aerospace.org. And of course, all of our shows are posted on YouTube and available by podcast. Let's go to Colonel Cashin and her guests.
Thank you, Colleen. Chief Master Sergeant Lerch and Mr. Clint Clark, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to see you again. We're going to kick off this session with how commercial capabilities can support our United States Space Force in the area of intelligence, which is pretty interesting and novel. In the 1950s, the Corona program led by the CIA had reconnaissance satellites, and we used to always use intelligence only from the U.S. government, or for us, the government. And now we're starting to move into leveraging commercial capabilities. And so this is really new to us and an interesting evolution in the area we're in. So I'm going to start off with Chief Lerch. I know that you work intelligence for Space Systems Command and for a U.S. Space Force in general. Could you tell us a little bit about the evolution of China and Russia's threats to our space domain?
Yeah, absolutely. First, just want to say thanks for having me here today, and it's good to see you again, Clint. Not too long ago, we were sharing a stage and talking about a very similar topic, and unfortunately, even since December of last year, the domain has changed significantly as more capabilities are arriving on orbit for both the Chinese and the Russians. Big picture, what I'll tell you is that if you look at 2015 timeframe from then to now, so about a decade, the Chinese on orbit sort of totality of systems has grown over 500%. Today we're looking at roughly over 1,000 satellites that the Chinese have, and a significant portion of those have a intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, or remote sensing role. And so they have a very good capability, I'll say, to be able to do remote sensing and to track and to survey essentially the globe. That being said, we also know that the PRC has historically had capabilities such as direct ascent anti-satellite missile tests. We know that they tested one against one of their own defunct satellites well over a decade ago. The Russians have also done this. But really, when we're talking about the Chinese, there's just been significant growth in the scale of the capabilities they have has really been eye-watering, especially over the past decade. While they may be sort of the lead competitor, when you look at the US and the capabilities that we should not forget about the Russians. The Russians we refer to typically as an acute threat in space. They might not have the same number of systems on orbit. In fact, they've only got roughly 300, between 250 to 300 satellites on orbit today. So nowhere near the total number that the Chinese have. But we have to remember that the Russians still represent a capability and a threat to different systems on orbit. Roughly about a year ago, we were able to talk publicly about the fact that we know that the Russians desire to put a anti-satellite capability on orbit that would carry a nuclear weapon. And while that certainly is not something that exists today, it is certainly something that we are tracking and very cognizant of. But again, it just goes to show that we can't discard completely the Russians just because they don't have the same number of systems on orbit.
Well, thanks for that summary. As you can see, it certainly has evolved, and it also the new entry of commercial capabilities has provided us additional sensing capabilities. Clint, from your background, can you tell us what some additional remote sensing capabilities there are out of the commercial area?
Thanks, Lina. Well, I'll start just by dovetailing off what Chief said. So, we provide commercial space situational awareness. So, loosely speaking, remote sensing upside down, right? So we're on the Earth watching what's going on overhead. And it ties exactly to what Chief said. Over the last 10 years, we've seen on-orbit SIGINT practice or signals intelligence techniques, characterization and inspection satellites, regular satellites, let's call them military satellites, doing counter-inspection techniques to avoid being inspected or characterized. We've seen techniques that look like co-orbital ASAP practice. We've seen direct ascent ASAP practice, both destructive and non-destructive. A variety of rendezvous and proximity operations, even docking and capture. And we've seen them done in a variety of interesting ways. Like, Chief kind of talked about the differences in Russia and China. I think, Russia has a smaller footprint, number of satellites than China. They tend to, from my perspective, maybe have some more sophisticated technologies on orbit, like their on-orbit SIGINT appears to be a more sophisticated system. But some of the things that China are doing, from my perspective, unprecedented. They're doing things where they're using, relative to US satellites, an enormous amount of delta V, an enormous amount of velocity in their maneuvers, up to including, 50 meters per second or more for individual tactics. And so that's a really large departure from what we would have considered routine space operations more than a decade ago. And I think that dovetails to what Chief says. So it's not just a numbers game, but they're focusing on capabilities. They're focusing on tactics that make the space domain more complicated, more challenging to manage. And so then when we kind of move to what you asked, what's available from a remote sensing perspective commercially, I think what you're seeing, the evolution of Russian and Chinese tactics, you're seeing a different kind of evolution on the commercial side. You're just seeing a rapid increase in, let's say, ingest of technology into the space domain. You're seeing more numbers, you're seeing different applications, exploitation, et cetera. I think when I think about your question, what am I seeing change? One, I think historically we've looked at commercial capabilities as something to augment, to fill in a handful of gaps. I think it's evolved from that over the last decade, where in many cases, commercials, the front line, they're providing the first indicators, and then we're filling in or doing more detailed work with military systems. And as we evolve that kind of across the spectrum from, say, EOIR imagery, now we're seeing SAR, we're seeing space-based radar, where there's a whole host of just applications of technology. And what I think we're going to see is the continued proliferation of that technology and then the increase of exploitation, so that let's say the conclusion of the TCPED process, the task, collect, exploit, process, disseminate, that process is being done more commercially as well, so that we're not sending the chief an image or a radar feed, but we're sending him an interpretation of what's going on. so he can move directly into the next step of his process.
Right. So having commercial capabilities being not just additive, but actually integrated in our space intelligence information chain. Chief Lerch, I was thinking about all of the different capabilities that we do have on orbit to look within space to space, but also ground to space, as Clint mentioned, from commercial capabilities. What do you see growing as far as situational awareness, and how does that bring resilience to our space operations?
Yeah, certainly. So, when you talk about resilience, a good rule of thumb really is that the more that you have of a certain type of capability, the better. Especially if you're talking about just having a diverse way to be able to gain that situational awareness. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket and then be limited to just one type of capability, especially in a potential future fight with some of these peer and near peer adversaries that are out there. That being said, the value of commercial, to piggyback off of a lot of what Clint was saying earlier, this is not something that's just recognized by the U.S. About a year after Xi Jinping took power, he unlocked sort of private investment into developing capabilities there in China. And what that led to was that unprecedented growth that I talked about earlier. And now you see that this concept of military civil fusion is sort of a flagship policy for the Chinese, and it certainly has enabled them to experience significant growth in that sector. If you look more recently at the war in Ukraine, it's pretty well documented that we've gone as far as to sanction certain companies for providing imagery to the Russians. And then as a result of sort of the role that commercial has played in that particular conflict, you've then seen how even spokespeople for the Kremlin have said very publicly that commercial or not, if you're supporting war efforts, you are a target. And so with the growth of commercial capabilities, with everything that they're going to bring to the fight and how services intend to leverage them, because it's not just the Space Force that wins by having commercial capabilities out there. It's the joint force. What we're really heading towards and spiraling towards is also a different era of conflict where the commercial capabilities that are out there, they have to realize that our adversaries and potential adversaries out there view them as a threat just as much as they do military systems.
Yeah, and I just add to what Chief said. As a former Air Force officer, we always talked about closing our OODA loop faster and faster and faster. And what we're seeing evolve in the space domain and why resilience is so important, to Chief's point. If we can't close the OODA loop in space, it will not be long before we can't close our OODA loops terrestrially. And so being able to bring more to the fight so that we can close the OODA loop faster than our adversary, that's what it's going to all be about.
Yeah, as we integrate commercial into our essentially kill chain with the intelligence at the forefront, what type of indemnification or what type of support should the government provide commercial companies that might help contribute to their success in helping us? Is there, like Chief, is there some kind of policy that we're supposed to defend commercial capabilities, or do we?
Yeah, that's a great question. The interesting thing there is when you consider sort of the space domain and how unique it is, some parallels exist to sort of the cyber domain. And, the NSA does a phenomenal job with their Cyber Collaboration Center to work very directly with industry to identify threats and have those conversations and sort of get left of any sort of potential security issues that may exist by sort of sharing some of that threat information. And that's certainly something that the Space Force is doing now, where we share with our allies, we share with commercial partners, both in unclassified and in classified settings, sort of what these threats are. Because yes, to your point, there is a threat coming. We have some responsibility in terms of the protect and defense of commercial capabilities. But really, a lot of those key conversations and critical sort of updates happen left of conflict. And our service is certainly doing that now by working with our commercial partners, again, both in unclassified and classified settings, to have those critical conversations and to make sure that they're aware of some of the latest threats.
And I think, as an executive at an entrepreneur, we're thinking about risk well to the left. Uh, do we want to get into this business? And if that decision is made, you've considered the risks you're taking. And so you're thinking about cyber, and the Space Force does a great job of communicating cyber threats to us. And their own sort of native policies for CMMC, other things like that, force you to be compliant with a certain level of security. I think as any company becomes more, I mean, we see it across the entire space industry. As a company becomes more critical to the Space Force, to the nation's defense, you natively see them get moved into a more protected status. For example, look at our launch sites, right? Right now they're Vandenberg and they're in Space Coast in Florida. Those are well protected facilities, right? And so when a satellite is getting pre-launched, it is on, there are guys with guns, there are dogs, there's a wire fence, there are people in boats. Like all of that sort of activity occurs to make sure that the platforms are safe and secure. And as you work through any of your campaign plans, if you recognize that a commercial asset is critical to your operation, commanders make sure that one, they have a protection plan in place for those assets. Two, they have alternatives, they have a contingency, so that there are native processes in place to make sure that happens. And so as a commercial company, I'm also beholden to my shareholders, I'm beholden to my other customers. So I'm looking at my own risk and my own ability to protect myself and make sure that I can deliver my capabilities. So those are just native functions, and I think just routine processes in government in general, Clint's opinion, have handled that pretty well over the last decade.
Yeah, using commercial capabilities opens up what they call open source intelligence. And there's been a lot of talk on how open source intelligence provides us some really big strengths. I mean, accessibility, affordability, transparency with our allies and partners, but also with our adversaries. There's also been some comments on using commercial capabilities in this way might open us up to susceptibility for like misinformation or ways that we need to make sure that we have careful verification of the information coming in. Clint, can you talk a little bit about, and or Chief as well, like what are some of the guidelines you use and what should we use for the government to integrate open source intelligence or commercial capabilities into our warfighting?
Chief, you want me to take this one first?
Yeah, please.
So, Lena, I think the first thing I would do is I would nuance your definition slightly. Like, I think about our business. We are not open source. We are commercially sourced. And what I mean by that is we don't put our information out and share it freely with the world. We provide a service. And so we're beholden to a level of service that we contract for. That includes timeliness, accuracy, completeness, protection of the data, things like that. And so when you source it commercially, and I'll say from us, but I think in general from any commercial vendor, what the government puts in those contracts is a defined level of service that they're expecting. And it's our job to meet that. And that includes quality and trust. When you move to what I would call pure open source, right? So it's made freely available. Those structures aren't in place. And in that case, my opinion, and we use open source information, we use freely available information from time to time to better our understanding. We look at that as use at your own risk because it doesn't have a verified service level for trust, timeliness, quality, etc. And so we have to make a value judgment out of that. Doesn't mean it's not good, doesn't mean it's not great, and it can be both. But you have to build in your own trust mechanism. How do you trust but validate? How do you build in structures in your own process to make sure what you're getting open source is trustworthy? Where when you commercially source it, that is done through the contracting process. There's a vetting process. There's a quality control process. Often the first thing we do is share examples of our data and have them independently validated by different parts of the government or by our customer group. And we don't really get to start until we show flat residuals for us, right? Our measurements are on the target we said they are. And we do that routinely. And then we build in routine processes to make sure that it's always that way. And we communicate quality throughout as part of that level of service. So it's a little bit nuanced, but I want to make sure we don't mix commercially sourced versus open source. Those are nuanced, slightly different things.
Yeah, and I'm really glad Clint hit the head of the nail on that, on the significance and how important it is to talk about the terminology and the difference between these things. Words matter, and so I'll give you an example. Within the past couple of weeks here, a agreement was signed between the U.S. Space Force and NGA for tactical surveillance, reconnaissance, and tracking, TAC-SRT. Right. And often in the past, people see that and they think, oh, this is just another way. This is intelligence. And it's not. Right. Those are operational planning products that are going to be provided to the combatant commanders. And that delineation doesn't seem like there's much behind it or there's much significance behind it. But it really is important that we delineate and we express what is intelligence versus what are just planning products. What is data that's just simply adding to a data lake that a combatant commander can then access to be able to make decisions in his particular area of operations. A big part of this too then is intel oversight. Intel oversight is something that we take absolutely seriously in our line of work, because we have to make sure this is not China. We respect people's privacy here, and so intel oversight is a very critical part of that. And we do our best to ensure that prior to going through any commercial solutions, anything that's open source intelligence, the privacy of our citizens is always at the forefront of any of those kind of conversations, to make sure that we're following the right processes, to make sure that we are doing our due diligence with regards to people's privacy.
So, Clint, back to you. One of the things that you mentioned was kind of your contractual obligations and all of your parameters that you need to meet. Do you see a commercial case for commercial intel sources that you've worked with? Is there a problem or an advocacy for like proprietary information?
Well, when I think about the business case, I'll do this kind of in steps, and then I'll get to the proprietary piece at the end. So when you think about a business case for a commercial entity, so I'm an entrepreneur. We started our own business. We started it so we could do the things we want to do. So sort of the very simplest business case is, can we do something well enough that someone will pay for it to generate enough money for us to keep doing the thing we want to do? And in our minds, that's how we started. We wanted to build things that worked, build things that get used. And we wanted, our expertise, our passion was in a certain area. Like, we're just going to go do it. And if we can make enough money to keep the lights on, then that's the business case. But we have shareholders, we're employee owned. And so we also have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders to monetize our investment, right? To get a return on investment, to reward the shareholders. And so that's sort of a subsequent next step in your business case. Is like, well, now how do you reward fairly all the people that you bring into this venture over time? And so kind of, step one, can I fund my passion project? And that's kind of how we got started. Step two is, can you make it profitable so you can do that forever? And then step three is, get a return on investment that rewards, in our case, our shareholders, which are our employees. So that's when I think about the business case, and we look at each of those and we kind of grew into them. When I think about IP, what we develop technologically in terms of IP, of course, we need to protect. It's like the Coke formula, right? Or it's like the Pepsi formula. It's the thing that sets you apart and makes you different. And so that is how we do what we do. It's not necessarily what we do. And so we absolutely want to protect how we do what we do, but we want to deliver the results of that. And so when I think about IP, it's about the creation, it's about the innovation. And it's nuanced from, say, like a traditional development project. Like if we were just hired to develop our telescope, our global infrastructure on government contract, the government would own all of that, and we would just build it for them and deliver. what we've done is work outside of the traditional acquisition process to build something commercially. And so what we did is we took all the development risk, we took all of the capital risk, we took those, and now we need to get a return on those. And so we need to protect the technologies that we've developed. And that's really where the IP comes in. So we never deliver the source that we developed on our own dollar. And no company is really asking. The U.S. government doesn't really ask you to do that. It's not, from my perspective, that's not a concern. But we do stay on top of making sure that we protect those, because that allows us to reap the reward of innovation. We do the development our own. We find a newer, better, faster, cheaper, more elegant way of solving a problem. Then we want to deliver the solution back to Chief. I don't want to deliver him lines of code that he then has to go and do all that work himself. And that's really where the evolution is. And that IP allows us to do something faster and cheaper, because the government doesn't have to then participate in the development process, right? We've been in the garage grinding for 15 years, and then we pop out ready to go. From the government's perspective, it's just overnight where this capability come from, because they weren't in there. The IP is what allows us to do that. And so that's what we'll protect. And the U.S. government is happily allows us to protect that and benefit from it. And from my perspective, it's even more so. All the direction we're seeing now from all the senior leaders in the Department of Defense, but especially the Space Force, is the utilization of commercial first, and then fill in with things that have to be military owned. And so we're seeing that direction from the top. It just takes time for that to trickle through all the way down to where, a small company like us interfaces, but we see it happening.
If I could just pull on that a little bit, the commercial companies usually innovate faster than the government in general. And I wanted to know how you are including AI, artificial intelligence, or machine learning in any of your systems that might help the U.S. government.
Yeah, so I'll give you just a sneak answer to how or why does industry innovate faster than government. The government has to write a contract. It's usually got some terms of reference that you have to meet. If you win that contract and you find out the government made mistakes in how they designed the system they want you to build, you're not really free to move on. Commercially, you think, well, we're going to go build this. And when you realize, that was a terrible idea, you can pivot off of it really quickly and go to some other designs, some other approaches. So that's one reason why we're free to innovate more quickly. With regards to AI, machine learning, I'll give you Clint's opinion. I think what we have done historically is focused on physics-based techniques, statistics-based techniques, mathematics techniques that we know and understand, and we try to implement them in blazing fast C code. Where we're seeing good use cases for machine learning and AI are when we don't understand the underlying physics, or the physics or the activity is evolving so fast, even in the fastest C code we can write, we can't recover. So hypersonic vehicles is a great example. A hyperglide vehicle, when it turns, I don't have a physics-based technique that can recover track as fast as that thing can break track. And so a machine learning technique is a very good approach to solving a tracking problem for something like that. When we talk about the space behaviors that we saw at the beginning, we have a pretty well understood model for the forces in space. And so when things are moving routinely and they're just doing basic station keeping, all those are really simple techniques. But when you're doing aggressive high delta V maneuvers, those don't really fit a model very well. And that human input, then, a machine learning algorithm is a pretty good technique for a model that you don't have well understood, right? I don't understand the human mind. So I use machine learning techniques, and then I can use those to reconstruct what I think their operation might be. And so those are kind of the interesting tactics. And that's in our domain. I see that kind of across the board in other remote sensing for downlooking players, because there are elements to their problem solving that don't fit models well, that are occurring, and changes are happening faster than they understand. And so AI and ML techniques are well suited to that. And then when we get to a level of scale, I think that's the end game. At some point, there's going to be more going on than the chief has teammates to put hands on keyboard. And I've got to have techniques not only that are fast and beautiful, but they've got to be trusted, right? You've got to have trusted autonomy so that those things can make decisions to move things, left to right in some process flow, and then deliver something that the chief can then execute against, or an operator that chief would support can execute against. So I think that's the path I see for AI, ML, and then ultimately true automation.
Yeah, Chief, do you have anything to add as far as the AI/ML, where you think the government is going in using that and leveraging it?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly an important capability that we're going to have to wrap our head around. How quickly we're going to be able to do that, and how we're able to do so in a safe manner is going to be pretty interesting to see, watch that unfold. What's important to note is that AI ML is not something that is certainly unique to the US in terms of our pursuit of it. The Chinese, in particular, have already invested in that type of a capability for on-orbit systems. We've talked in some of our unclassified briefings that we provided around industry and just in some public forums. We've talked very extensively about the fact that they were willing to share in a completely unclassified, open source academic sort of literature. They had already done this with a synthetic aperture radar satellite on orbit, and really the key part of this and why they were trying to do this and why they want AIML. They want to be able to see and detect ships automatically transiting across the Pacific Ocean.
Yep.
Right. And so much of what you're going to get from AIML is speed and enhanced decision making. And really, that's sort of that next cornerstone of modern warfare, right? Is who's going to be able to make the decision faster? How can you sort of close a distance even faster or quicker? And you're going to get there through successfully integrating AI ML. But as is the case with all applications for it, what's going to be really important is that data lake and how secure is it? How valid is it? The training of it, all those kind of things are going to be just as important as just having AI ML involved in some of your programs.
It seems like as we have more information coming to us from commercial sources and some open source intelligence, but like all of these different funnels coming in, that could increase our transparency globally, both to our adversaries and our allies. Can you speak to the deterrence effect of including commercial capabilities and leveraging the information from those?
Yeah, I mean, simply put, for us, the way we look at it is it flips the cost curve on the adversary, right? It's as simple as this. If there was a whiteboard and it had the total number and order of battle, if you would, of the United States Space Force and everything that we have on orbit today, an adversary could look at that, analyze it, and they could say, all right, well, just from basic beam counting, this is what I need, the number of missiles, I need the number of these kind of capabilities to be able to remove enough of those sort of off the whiteboard to then gain an advantage. We flip the cost curve on them significantly by involving commercial assets, because now that whiteboard and the number of assets that they have to worry about jumps significantly. And if you look at something just like the proliferated architectures that we're moving towards, those are, again, another example of how we flip the cost curve on the adversary, where it's almost like Pyrrhic victory, right? Like, is it worth it where you expend everything that you've got and you put a dent in the overall capability that the Space Force and commercial is able to actually provide? And so that's something that is so important to note and understand, because that's now where the Chinese are going. I alluded to this a little bit earlier in sort of the satellite growth for them. They now too are chasing proliferated networks as well, because they see the utility of it. They see the value in having an architecture like that. So, and that's sort of what the future holds in terms of the transparency, I would say, and sort of what that does to decision making and sort of how that evolves the domain even further.
Yeah, Chief, I just add, kind of old school military thinking: reveal to deter, conceal to win. And by having just proliferated sensing capabilities, it gets harder and harder to not reveal your systems or their tactics, especially in the space domain, because there is no Area 51, right? It's all overhead, which means it's all accessible to remote sensing technologies, whether it's EOIR, radar, passive RF. If you're in space doing something, you can be detected. And if you can be detected, you can be tracked. And if you can be tracked, I can break down the components of your techniques and try to infer what it is you're doing or what you're capable of doing. And so that's really where the growth of commercial is driving transparency, but really it's collapsing that ability to conceal. And like Chief said, that's breaking, has potential to break the cost curve for some capabilities.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll add to that, when it comes to the importance of that transparency, sort of the opposite view on that is, it is because of a lot of these commercial capabilities that are out there that we, as a service, are able to help illuminate sort of the threat that exists in the domain. You rewind the hands of time a decade plus ago, and the kind of things that we're talking about in our quarterly unclassified fact sheet that we produce and some of the briefings that Clint and his team produce, these are things that you would have never been talking about outside of a SCIF, right? A sensitive compartmented information facility, right? Where you do top secret things. You would have never been having some of these conversations outside of those environments. And in some of the dialogue that we've had, whenever we engage with our congressional leaders, when we give them sort of our classified analysis on things in the space domain, the immediate concern is, well, how do you tell that to the public? How do you get constituents to understand what's happening in the space domain and the significance behind it? How do you justify the need for a U.S. Space Force, even to a certain extent, right? And a budget that's going to be needed to be able to confront the kind of things that we have to worry about here in the next 10, 20 years. We aren't able to do that if it weren't for the commercial capabilities that are out there that help illuminate those threats and those activities, and then enhance and enrich our ability to communicate that at a completely unclassified level. And then more importantly, and I think it's often forgot about, unclassified information isn't just now, hey, we can talk to the general public. It is an enabler for us to now work with our allies, right? Now we don't have to worry about, oh, well, this is secret, no foreign, it's not releasable. So it's going to hinder our ability to sort of talk about these sort of future endeavors and potential capabilities that we want to work with our allies on. Because of these things that are out there now at a completely unclassified level, that absolutely strengthens our ability to sort of help communicate that why to the various allies that we got out there.
Yeah, well said. That's a great summary of how intelligence and the added transparency of commercial capabilities can help our internal audience within the United States understand the threat and then what we're doing about it, but also deter our adversaries from acting in ways that we don't want them to. So one final question. I really appreciate you both being here. What message would you like to leave the decision makers about using commercial capabilities that are right at our fingertips? So let's see, either one of you go first, and then
Chief, how about I go first and I'll give you the last word? Will that work?
Sounds great.
Yeah, so Lina, what I would say, what I want to leave behind for decision makers. So I think at decision makers at all levels, I would want to say governments no longer have a monopoly on decision quality information. And you just got to, I think at many levels we've come to terms with that, but I think at all levels you have to come to terms with that. And once you do, then you say, well, what next? I would say within the Department of Defense, especially within the Space Force, we're hearing our most senior leaders make the case themselves. We need to be doing more with commercial. I would say to those decision makers, 1, 2, or 3 levels down, they're right. You need all the help you can get, and there's an armada of companies out there dying to help you get better at this and solve the problems that you're facing. Give those organizations, give us a chance. I think many of us are already participating. I think there's many more. We've got to find a way to unleash, kind of without shackles, our most lethal weapon, and that's the innovative growth mindset of our entrepreneurs. If we bring that to bear, it makes us a more lethal fighting force. And I absolutely commit all you guys. Let's get after it together. And with that, I'll give it back to you, Chief.
Yeah, honestly, I look at it through a pretty simple lens. We're a service that has a $30 billion budget, and what that really equates to is about 2 aircraft carriers. And so what I'm saying there is, like, we don't have the resourcing available to take a look at everything that's already being provided commercially and say, hey, let's rebuild that. Hey, let's get the government version of that. I don't think anyone is going to believe that we're just going to magically grow a budget, north of $100 billion anytime near in the future. And so the reality of the situation is we have very wicked problems ahead of us. We're starting to see that all sort of culminate with Golden Dome, which we didn't talk too much about today, but that's a very real threat, right? Homeland being held at risk by capabilities that a lot of people probably don't even understand exist right now. The space domain and the problems that exist there, again, very difficult to appreciate and understand the complexity of the threats there. Very wicked problems. It's going to require wicked solutions. And the reality is we're not going to be able to do it alone with just government assets. Like, we have to tap heavily into commercial.
Well, thank you both. It's been such a pleasure. And talking about how commercial capabilities can not only add to our military intelligence, but really augment it in so many ways. So thank you. I appreciate you both coming on, and to Mr. Clint Clark and to Chief Lerch, have a great day and enjoy.
Thanks, Lina. Great seeing you, Chief.
Great seeing you as well. And thanks, Lina.
Thank you. Back to Colleen.
Well, thank you for joining us, Chief Lerch, Clint, and Lina. The Chief's take on how commercially sourced intelligence can inform the public and deter adversaries is interesting. And I think Clint really brought home the parameters for the business case around private industry's relationship with government. So great discussion, Lina. Thank you. To our audience, all of our shows are available wherever you get podcasts, and you can watch the show on YouTube. Be sure to check out the other episodes in our short 6-part series on Going Faster. This one is only the first. Follow us on LinkedIn to get notified and engage with other speakers. And you can also go to csps.aerospace.org to subscribe to our newsletters. Thank you to James Liggins, our technical director. And of course, to our audience, until next time.